Before we move into too detailed of a discussion about function of behavior and a FBA process, it's really important that you understand some basic behavior terms that will be utilized throughout this training. You should have already taken a quick pre-assessment to know which of these words you are familiar with and some that are potentially new to you. When we're discussing basic behavioral analysis, all rooted in the science of ABA, we tend to call this the ABCs of behavior. It's a very simplified view of analyzing a student's behavior through the lens of what caused it to happen, what happened afterward that could make it potentially happen again, and what are the underlying functions of that student's behavior. So, as a quick review, you've already seen this, but behavior has two main functions: to get something or to get out of something. Everything we do as human beings is to gain or avoid something. And it is so critical for you to consider this because if we can understand why a behavior is happening, we can more effectively and efficiently decrease behavioral errors and increase appropriate or desired behaviors. But without knowing that function of behavior and the why behind it, it's much harder to shape student behavior. Again, this should not be new, but as a quick review, there are four primary functions of behavior: sensory, escape, connection or attention, and tangible. And so when you're looking at these categories and considering your student behavior, you can look at if the student was trying to gain sensory input or avoid sensory input. So if you have a student who likes to bounce, slam, jump, hop, skip, run, they're loud, they're big, they're always moving, chances are they are a sensory seeking child. And it doesn't mean all behaviors they do will be sensory seeking, but that's a great place to start to make sure that the sensory needs are met for the student if we know they have a really high tolerance for sensory input. Likewise, on the other side of that coin, if you have a student who is sensory avoidant, lots of noises, motion, activity might be hard for them and cause unwanted behaviors. So it's great to kind of look at this lens and consider, are any of these categories potentially a underlying cause of what's going on with the student? Like I said, the ABCs of behavior is just a lens that we view behavior through. A stands for antecedent, B for behavior, and C for consequence. We're going to look at what each of these means, but a basic, very quick overview is that the antecedent is what happens before the behavior that may influence or cause it. The behavior itself is what someone says or does, and the consequence is what happens after the behavior. One quick important note is that if you are trying to utilize this lens of viewing behavior, it's important that you identify the behavior first. So determine what was said or done, and then look at the antecedent, and then look at potential consequences that impacted it. One type of antecedent is known as a trigger. A trigger is an environmental antecedent. It's an event that happens before the behavior, although sometimes there's a delay. We can't say that it happens within 5 minutes of the behavior. Some triggers are really easy to figure out. When a student loses a game in gym class, when they fail a test, when a demand is put on them that is hard for them to do, when a fire alarm goes off. Those are all really easy triggers to identify. Unfortunately, human behavior isn't that easy to understand. So at times, you might have to look really carefully at the situation to determine what was the thing that caused this behavior to happen. And know that triggers are different for every person. And also sometimes different on different days. So, what triggered a student one day might not be as impactful on another day. Something that's related to a trigger is called a setting event. These often can be misconstrued as a trigger, But a setting event is more of a condition or a situation that makes a specific behavior more or less likely to occur. But it's not the immediate cause of the behavior. So, for example, a student who forgot to eat breakfast in the morning because they were running late and then came to school, was pretty normal until they got to maybe their language class around 10:30 in the morning. And then the teacher says, "Hey, I need you to redo this writing project because you did not do a good enough job on it. And I know you can do better work. And this is not acceptable work from you." On a day where the student maybe wasn't hungry and had missed breakfast, that would have been something they could deal with. But on this day where the student didn't eat breakfast, that setting event of skipping breakfast, being hungry, not having the nutritional needs met became a setting event. And then the trigger itself was the demand of redoing their writing. So a setting event is almost like a slow trigger or an underlying conversation or cause that is just below the surface. And it kind of is a good thing to think about of as a, how did we set this student up for success or not up for success? Because sometimes these setting events on a typical day, if the setting event didn't happen, the student would be okay losing the game or going through a transition. But on the day where the setting event was also present, it almost created a recipe for them to be more likely to exhibit the behavior. So, setting events can have long term impact and effects. They're often more of an indirect influence in the behavior. They can be physiological, like I said, hunger, lack of sleep, not feeling well, or environmental, things like a change in their typical routine or schedule. They overslept, conflict with family. I would also put in here maybe like having a substitute for the day rather than the typical adult they're working with. And then they also potentially could be social or emotional. So, long term impacts of things like stress or loneliness. As adults, when we go through a stressful period of time at work or with family, maybe we're caregiving for a sick family member, we usually do okay for a little bit. And then when that stress compounds, then we often say things like, "I have a really short fuse," or "I'm just not dealing with this well because of my caregiving needs at home." So consider that about the underlying, reoccurring kind of story that's being told with the student in any given day that maybe could make them more likely to react to a trigger. Signals are related to triggers and setting events, but they're actually something that is a behavior. So it's something we can see in the student that they will exhibit before we get to the more serious behaviors, the ones that would go under the B in ABC. So for many students, this could be, like clenching their fists or starting to breathe heavier or becoming like agitated or twitchy or getting up and moving around. All of these are those signs or signals that a behavior might be coming. Whenever I train paraprofessionals, I always say that they are the best at identifying signals because they are most often hands on with the students, engaging day to day, boots on the ground. So they're really quick at picking up on individual signals. And they can usually say, "This is not going to go well. I can tell something's happening." So signals can be unusual, they can be sensory, they can be vocal. And some signals are really common, and some students are really unusual. So, knowing your student is going to be the key here because if we can identify the signal, we can decide how we're going to react. Are we going to try to de escalate? Are we going to try to ignore? Do we need to step in and co regulate with this student? So the ABCs, the antecedent, which could be a trigger, a setting event, there's signals involved in the antecedent. And then the B is behavior, the behavior itself, which should be the first thing you identify when considering the ABC lens. Our goal here is to teach the student. So, when we determine what the behavior is, it should always be measurable and observable. That means that if you're using a phrase for student behavior that's like a character trait or an emotion, that's really not measurable and it's not always observable. So, let's give some examples. Some great examples are thinking about what they're actually doing, what they're actually saying. Are they crumpling their paper? Are they throwing a book? Are they crying or yelling expletives? Are they hitting a peer? Those are all examples of things that would be negative behaviors. There's also positive behaviors, raising your hand before answering a question in class, completing one step or two step directions, requesting items when they are wanted. Some non examples, though, of behavior that is measurable or observable would be mad, aggressive, cooperative, pleasant, disrespectful. Even the term bullies peers is really hard to say it's measurable or observable. We need more specific than bullies peers. So, when you are filling out referral forms or considering a student's behavior or trying to do one of these ABC analysis, please know that to set yourself up for success, you really must have a measurable and observable behavior listed. A general principle of behavior to keep in mind is that it's always easier to prevent a behavior from occurring than to deal with it after it happened. So that is why we spend so much time considering the antecedent in the ABCs. Because if we can step in before it happened, we're going to be much more successful in de escalating that student and getting the behaviors we want out of them. And then the C in the ABCs is consequence. Now, when we use the word consequence colloquially in our conversation, usually we're considering it as something negative, but it's important to remain that consequence is not punishment. Consequence is anything that happens after the behavior that will impact the likelihood of it happening again. So it's very closely connected to the idea of reinforcement. We often reinforce things we don't mean to. Sometimes we reinforce and make behaviors worse in the moment. So keep in mind that consequence is often equally as hard to determine because we are always reinforcing each other's behaviors with nonverbal and verbal cues.